A few talks ago, I mentioned how we as parents had this question that often we'd use to prompt our little children when someone that gave them a gift or did something nice for them. We'd ask our children, "Now, what do you say?" And we hoped that they would respond by saying, "Thank you." Most of the time they did. But really, that's a great question to ask ourselves every day when we don't feel like it. "Hey, Michael, what do you say?" Now, we've already walked down a couple of paths that can help us cultivate a heart of gratitude. So today's is the third path. The third way that we can cultivate a grateful heart is by expressing gratitude often and openly. Often and openly. The third way I can develop a heart of gratitude is when I start expressing thanks, just saying it. See, we open ourselves up to gratitude when we express gratitude, even the times we don't even feel like it, at least not yet. There's just something about the way that God made us. When we begin to express gratitude, we very often begin to feel grateful. Our heart has to catch up to what we know to be right, what we're saying. And sincere words of gratitude have enormous power. I keep thank you notes that people have written me over the years in my study. People write such great things like, "Thank you," or "I appreciate something that you did," "I'm praying for you," or just "I'm for you." Now, during 25 years as a pastor, I would get other kind of notes from time to time. Usually they were emails that didn't say those kinds of things. Now, it's important when we get those kinds of notes or emails to respond to them in a Christ-like way. But I'll just say this, I don't savor those emails or notes. But sometimes I reread those words of thanks and they just cheer my spirit. I mean, do you know how powerful your words of thank you are to the people in your world? Maybe you need to speak those words to somebody in your life, and maybe it's just a friend. There's a story I was reading, true story, back in the early 1930s, a pastor by the name of William Stidger. He was having lunch one day with a group of gentlemen in a restaurant, and they were talking about what we now call the Great Depression, how terrible it was, how sad to see people suffer, even rich people committing suicide, all of the jobless people, the whole thing. And the conversation, he said, got more and more miserable as it went on. And another minister friend in the group suddenly broke in and said, "I don't know what I'm going to do, because in 2 or 3 weeks, I have to preach a sermon on Thanksgiving Day. And I'd kind of like to say something positive or affirming. But what can I say that's affirmative in a time of our world that's so depressed and awful?" And as the minister spoke, Stidger began to feel like the Spirit of God was speaking to him, urging him, "Why don't you give thanks to those people who have been a blessing in your life? Why don't you affirm them during these terrible times?" So he began to think about that, and the thought came to his mind of a school teacher he had years ago who was very dear to him. She was a wonderful teacher of poetry and English literature, and she had gone out of her way to put a great love of literature in him. And it affected the way he wrote now. It affected his preaching. So he sat down and he wrote a letter to this woman that was up in years, and it was only a matter of days until he received a reply in this feeble scrawl of an elderly person, and it said, "My dear Willie." Now, Stidger said at that time he was about 50 years of age, and he was bald, and no one had called him Willie for a really long time. So just the opening sentence warmed his heart. But here's the letter. She said, "My dear Willie, I can't tell you how much your note meant to me. I'm now in my 80s, living alone in a small room, cooking my own meals, lonely, and like the last leaf of autumn lingering behind. And listen to this next sentence. You'll be interested to know that I taught in school for more than 50 years, and yours is the first note of appreciation I've ever received. It came on a blue, cold morning, and it cheered me as nothing has done in many years. Stidger said, now I'm not sentimental, but I found myself weeping over that note. And that continued to stir him to write a previous pastor he knew that's now retired, an old man who had just lost his wife in death, and he's all alone now. And this pastor years ago had taken time to mentor him, to give him advice and counsel, and to love him when he was just beginning in the ministry. So he sat down and he wrote this old pastor, and in 2 days a reply came back. And it said, "My dear Will, your letter was so beautiful, so real, that as I sat reading it in my study, tears fell from my eyes, tears of gratitude. And before I realized what I was doing, I rose from my chair and I called her name to share it with her, forgetting she was gone. You'll never know how much your letter has warmed my spirit. I've been walking around in the glow of your letter all day long." Maybe your parents need to hear those words of gratitude today. Maybe your parents got a lot of things wrong when they were raising you. And maybe that relationship has enough pain attached to it that some of it needs to be resolved, addressed before you can be authentic in your gratitude. Don't let that linger. Take care of that. Move toward them. Maybe like mine, they're no longer around, and I would love to thank my mom and dad today if I could. Some of you have mom and dads who got some stuff right, and they just need to hear you say, "Thanks, Mom. Thanks, Dad." I believe something will happen inside your heart when you say thank you. Maybe it's a coach or a neighbor who believed in you, someone who breathed life in you. They had these dreams for you, and they comforted you when you needed that kind of comfort. What do you say? Write a note to them. Call them. Hey, even send them a text. Maybe it's somebody in your immediate family and you just need to go and hug them sometime today. Maybe it's time to do something extravagant. Even though it's Christmas, you get a gift for them before Christmas and then one at Christmas. What do you say? We open ourselves up to gratitude when we express it openly and often, even if we don't feel like it yet. I'll see you next time.